So I'm going to continue with my commentary, reflections on Proverbs. I've been in chapter 24. I'm currently on verse 28. It reads, "Be not a witness against your neighbor without cause, and deceive not with your lips." So as always, we approach the Proverbs as a key that opens a door, not necessarily as a directive. Although there is direction within the verse, undoubtedly, we must explore it. We must bring ourselves into it in order for it to be committed to memory or to be integrated into the way that we interact and interface in the world. Now, this type of verse, this theme we have seen before. Before I continue, perhaps I should apologize for my laptop that is hard at work. I'm sure the microphone is picking some of that up. Now, this word witness, this is something that I've talked about before a few times throughout the Proverbs. It's an interesting word to explore. What it means to see something, what it means to witness something. And then in the broader context in which this verse means, it is more than just observing. There's a behavior, an action. Well, observing, I suppose, is a behavior, but there is a certain direction that is more than just some observation. As I observe all sorts of things, as I look in front of me now, I see a bunch of things in my cubby in my desk. It's a bit disorganized, a bunch of different pens, a remote, a charger. And yet, as I was talking a moment ago, this information was in front of me, it was within my visual field, and yet I didn't pay any attention to it. There's a certain sense in which my observations and the information that I was taking in was not sufficient to attend to everything that is in front of me, because my primary attention was directed elsewhere. It was directed towards mind. It was directed towards perhaps the book to a certain degree in the physical aspect, but again, since I'm focusing now on this cubby, I had every opportunity to utilize and make salient all of that information, but I chose not to. And so while this is an aspect of what it means to witness something, it certainly is not the whole of the picture. If we refer back to our etymological roots, we have the word wit in Old English that referred to knowledge. It was an act of knowing in a certain sense, a state or a quality of knowing. We have a meaning from the Proto-Indo-European, meaning to see, or again to know. In the modern day, there's an aspect of the word witness that seems to imply the seeing of an event, the observation of some event, by which the fact of that event may be useful in a judicial proceeding. The word witness is also used, obviously, in religious contexts, by which the manner in which one witnesses something has to do with their faith, it has to do with their beliefs, it has to do with the evidence for, or the reason for, why they have come to understand or to believe in something that they have come to believe in. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that this word witness is complicated. And we can infer perhaps a degree of what is being meant here, but at the same time, we don't necessarily want to restrict, because we want to leave the door open. This is a key, after all. The verse is, "Be not a witness against your neighbor without cause." Now, if I'm going to witness my neighbor, I can open my eyes and I can see my neighbor. That in and of itself doesn't really tell me all that much. I can open my eyes and I can see the pens that are in my cubby. And yet, just as I've mentioned, if I'm not paying attention to it, then the information that is entering into my brain, surely, really has no place or no salience for which it can lay down to rest in a memory. And now, as I'm thinking about it, I'm looking around at all the different things that are in my field of view currently without really turning my head. And it's amazing, all of the different things that I am not paying attention to, that I'm suddenly discovering is actually something that I can pay attention to. But if it is the case that I begin to see something, and I do more than just superficially look at it, because as I've mentioned, I can look at something and yet be absorbed within thought, within my mind, within reflection, and still, even though my eyes are not wandering from one place to another, and they're consciously fixed on something. For example, right now, I moved away from the pens in the cubby, and now I'm focusing on a small red light that appears on a television that I never use, indicating that it is off. And now, as I speak of it, as I pay attention to it more and more, I begin to observe different aspects of this red dot, where it is in relationship to the broader physical object, that it is not in the middle of the structure in which it rests. I think about the surrounding glow and the black sensor, or the apparatus that picks up the information from the remote. I'm thinking about the quality of its emission, how it is really not all that bright. It's not like staring into a light bulb, or staring into the sun for that matter. It is something that I can tolerate for an extended period of time. Perhaps I'm thinking, as a matter of projection, that it could appear quite ominous as it reflects off the keys on my keyboard. But I say all of this to say that once our attention goes to something, goes towards something, as we witness the facts of a particular thing in our landscape, then what we may see is more than what we had taken in the first instance. Now, in a relatively simple object, the type of witnessing that we are doing is relatively minimal. There's really nothing going on with this red light. The judgments that I can make of it, if I sat here for a while, perhaps I could come up with something interesting, but observing this versus observing other physical phenomena will have differences. Now, if I go back to the analogy that I had mentioned about my neighbor, and I see this person, and I see more than just the superficial qualities, that I'm paying attention to this person's behavior. I'm paying attention to this person's ends. It may be the case that I may find something about what they are doing that is unjust, or that is just. The fact is, I will pass some judgment on what they are doing, how they are behaving. Now, if I have no cause, there is no reason for the shift in my attention towards this person. Keeping in mind that I'm not looking at this person to say hello. I'm not looking at this person to invite over for dinner. I'm looking at this person to watch, to observe. But I suppose since it's not a cause, I'm not doing it because I want to observe. I am sort of listlessly, passively taking in information. A rather strange thing to do, I know. However, I think what we are being prompted to consider is the danger that this poses. Even if we have some cause, we have some reason to be paying attention to our neighbor, even if, perhaps I should say, our attention leads us to find something that we didn't wish to find, or didn't seem to expect that we would find. There's something within the cause. There's something within the root of intention that is of importance here. Now, there's a bigger issue, surely, that we will get to in a moment. But this root, again, this map of mind is large. The map of mind extends beyond just one individual. It includes us as it includes the material reality. It is something that is formed of the relationships of things. And the attention given by one mind to another surely is a component, a piece, a node in that network or in that framework. And although there may be indirect links between one's thoughts and another's, at least in terms of our perception, I think the subtlety of that which is unseen, the delicacy of our thoughts, how imprecise they may be, and how difficult they may be to describe, this witnessing and this knowing, again, of its various components, in some sense I feel trapped. I feel trapped by my inability to see it, but by my ability to feel it as though I'm in a prison cell, with a window to the outside. The window is above my height, so I cannot see out of it. But I can feel the breeze that comes through it. Every so often I can hear the chirping of the birds. And so I know that there's something outside of it. My heart tells me so. Even my senses tell me so. But I'm destined to this place. Like Plato and his allegory of the cave. Surely there are periods of transcendence. But there are also periods of uncertainty, I think, given the state of acclimation that the man had gone through when he exited the cave, which was his darkness of mind, and he found himself in a new environment. They had a period of acclimatization, looking into the water to see the forms that he is unable to see because of the intensity of all the information that he takes in. Surely that process would be quite confusing. More confusing than the simple, shadowy figures that he knew of all of reality and of experience that were projected on the cave wall. And now, my mind is going towards finding a prison at every step. That's not a productive way to see things. Be not a witness against your neighbor. Now, what I mean to say here is that although I understand this verse at a particular level, I know there's a layer, a level of clarity that exists on a slightly higher level that I'm trying to access. Certainly it causes me to spin my wheels every once in a while, but I wish to discover a little bit more, again, about this witness, because within knowing there is so much. Within that relationship of understanding and of having information at one's disposal, information that was carried out willfully by another agent, and now we have taken it as this sort of event in time, and we could do with it as we will. And as the verse suggests, we are doing it against our neighbor. That there is this contrariness to the way in which we utilize the information. That there is an antagonism, a pull in the opposite direction. Perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly. But the matter is, against our neighbor without cause, the root of causality is important. That we must have some reason to justify our actions. But it is not just reason that would form this cause, I think. Because I think the writer of this verse would recognize that although I may have some reason to use the information that I have observed against my neighbor, I may do it to satisfy my own selfish desires, and to use the information and to bend it, to twist it in all sorts of different ways to gain something of theirs, perhaps that I envy. And in this sort of situation, we are not saying that because we have a cause in this situation, now then we can use our observations against our neighbor. That is not it. And so I'm not sure how much of this aspect of thinking and of reason that I can contribute to cause. I think there must be more. There must be a cause that is independent of reason. That reason can follow it, but it is not something that reason uses to create something that is not. For then it is creating something without cause. So it must follow. If it is to follow, it must follow the way that things are. And if the way that things are unjust, then it comes to be given a broader consensus. And that broader consensus is designed to reduce the risk that comes from the self's misinterpretation or willful twisting of that which is into something else, into something that which is not, or into a road or a path that is for the future self to address. That it is a cause that is formed to meet some end in the future. For reason surely is justification. But it doesn't imply truthfulness. Or, perhaps I should say, it doesn't imply correctfulness. That there will be misidentification. There is always the story of the witness in a case that has misunderstood what they saw, or perhaps what they saw, what they remember, is not accurate to the events that had unfolded. Be not a witness against your neighbor without cause, and deceive not with your lips. And so a perfect ending to this verse, because the ending answers the question of the potential problem that is brought up by the word cause, and the using of the observation against our neighbor. Because now, if we are to hold our tongue and to deceive not, and to say that which was seen in the manner that it was seen, for no purpose other than to state as it was, then there will be no deception, there will be no twisting of the information. And as such, it is open to the judgment of all. It is open to accurate consideration, to proper judgment. And it restricts the causal, reasonable aspect of mind into a domain that is honest. That what is said must be, or what is reported of what was witnessed must be, that which was truly seen, honestly. Say not, I will do so to him as he has done to me. I will render to the man according to his work. So immediately my mind goes to Matthew 7:12. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. Now here, of course, we're not saying the same thing per se, but we are saying not to do the opposite of that thing. Say not, I will do so to him as he has done to me. I will render to the man according to his work. So the obvious question is, why? Why should we not do to someone as they have done to us? Now I thought for a moment at how tedious sometimes my interpretations of these verses can be. And I thought, well, in order to understand why I should not do to him as he has done to me, I have to understand what it means to do something. Now, if this is not tedious or pedantic, it's hard to imagine what is, but by the same token, as I've read through this, I come to some desire to go into what it means to actually to do something, ironically. I almost laugh thinking about it. I laugh because it's simple. It's something that ought to readily come to my mind, but when I pose myself the question, especially if I imagine a situation in which my emotions are flaring and I am ready and willing to do something to somebody that has caused me harm in some way, I'm not so certain that I would have a strong answer to fall back on when the question then arises, or perhaps the instinct then arises, where the next reasonable or next feelingable, as funny as that word sounds, the next thing that feels to me to be correct would be to return the insult. And so if it is to be true that one ought not to do this or to say it, then why is it the case that this should not be returned? Now, my apologies, I may have to go into discussing what it means to do something, although it's simple. I think also there may be some fruit to be had within this broader picture of mind and the broader commitment to doing good things. The larger commitment of faith, some reason that we have to believe in something that is, from my view, can be independent of our feelings. At least in my case, I am tempted at times to do that which is contrary to what I believe to be right, because my feelings desire something. And much like the scenario in which I'm imagining perhaps a road rage type of situation, these sorts of experiences for me are always the most infuriating. Often these situations are met with some quick emotional response. And it is within the strong emotional response that there is the weakest of moments, the moments that we are most susceptible to infiltration and temptation, the moments that we are most likely to say, "I will do so to him as he has done to me." But we keep in mind a commitment, again, a commitment to God, a commitment to faith, that in and of itself in the modern day is not something that is implicitly understood anymore. At least in my situation, it requires a little bit more thought. And it is not the case that I necessarily feel that giving into temptation at any particular point in which I feel challenged or threatened is the way that I go about life. I certainly don't. And I certainly don't sit there and question it as I am trying to reflect on this now. The faith is something that comes almost as rapidly as the feelings. In order to combat the feelings, it's as though faith comes almost without reason. But it doesn't mean that it's not attached to reason, or that it can't be found within reason. We may be startled by something, but it is not because we are startled that we are unreasonable. There was a situation or a loud noise, whatever, that had stimulated the response, that had elevated the heart rate, spiked the adrenaline. And so going back to what I had mentioned about this broader map of mind, there's a lot to be thought of when one imagines this illustration. But of particular attention what I think is important to consider is the logos, the center point of that intelligibility. Much like we can think of ourselves, including our physical body, as collections of cells, as collections of different processes and organs, many of which have their own roles. They have a type of intelligence of their own. This type of intelligence is not the same in terms of degree as our own, but they have their purposes and they solve problems. We have our purposes and we solve problems. And just because we carry the cells that solve problems at one level doesn't mean that those agents are not part of this broader map of mind. In a certain way, everything can be seen under this framework, or with this idea. And now I'm not necessarily making a case for a panpsychism here, but I am making a case that well, perhaps there's a degree of panpsychism here, but it's not a pantheism necessarily. There is, if we are to make a case for panpsychism, which I'm not really sure that I'm doing, but the understanding or the view that we exist within a broader landscape of mind and of agents, that we live in an agentic arena, I think is particularly appealing, because the way in which we see this map and the various levels of organization is the very way in which we scale up towards that center point, that logos, that divine logos, which we would consider to be God. And what's interesting to me is to think about these various levels and their participation in the broader thing. Now, I can imagine a situation in which, within this agentic arena, considering the various levels, and again, I would say that the levels refer to different types of experience for which an agent can solve issues, solve problems. Now, I think in my view, complexity has some place here, but I'm not entirely sure that complexity is a good way to organize the levels. As I understand it, there are quite simple organisms that can solve sophisticated problems. And so perhaps complexity is not the way that we should organize these things. We can also organize things that, much like an individual or a human being that is almost an agentic arena in and of himself or herself, that there are organisms, there are cells that have a degree of agency, again, that they can solve problems independent of other things directing them to do so, that my mind is not necessary, or myself is not necessary in order for my liver to function. So we can think of this type of organization as almost a participatory, emergent thing that all scales to a being that directs the rest of the lower levels. And now I suppose that there is something here, much like there is in considering complexity. And perhaps the two are not exclusive, that the two are related, that there are dimensions of this map that I wish to see and define. However, I will say that despite my relationship to my cells, the self that I am is independent from other selves, and other cells for that matter. That somebody else's liver function is not it does not have any bearing on my own liver function. If somebody's liver fails, it's not as though that I pay the consequence or I am impaired because of it. And so there is this separation of agents that among certain levels, an agent can be sacrificed or an agent can be damaged, and another agent will not necessarily also be damaged. Now this brings up questions of participation. This brings up question again of the levels. Because if we move up to the human level, and I say up, which I think is a bit of an arbitrary distinction, but it's useful to a certain degree. Now when I say up, perhaps I should be a little bit more precise about what I mean. What I mean is that the cells that are participating in my experience contribute to my experience, and the agent that I consider to be myself is, for the most part, in control of the broad movement of these cells, the purpose for which is beyond the scope of any particular cell. But collectively, it forms an agent that has authority over the rest. Now, much like a nation, I think that there is a boundary or a border that is placed around what I consider to be myself. And as I've just mentioned, this boundary necessarily separates me from somebody else. Now, when we move to the level of a network of participation that forms a different level of agent, that the particular nodes of a network and the problems that they solve may not be what the overall agent is interested in or concerned with. It may be to a degree, or there may be some relationship to it. But when we get up to the level of the agent, that represents some unification of that network, we find that that agent, I think, also participates in a broader network. And that this broader network we can think of as human civilization, as a family, whatever it might be. We can place boundaries across many different types of agents. Now, I think here comes an interesting point, because when we consider the type of agent that a family or that a city or a state possesses, it's quite obvious that there's a spirit associated with these things, or a degree of agency. Perhaps I'm conflating the two. And I think what is also clear is that despite this broader thing, let's just say it's a nation, because we're dealing with a lot of interesting geopolitical issues these days, that the agents that are formed of human beings, or that their agency, their presence of mind, their ability to solve problems is seemingly as much different as the agency of a particular cell of my body to the agency of my self that is talking into this microphone, that is directing the broader or the unified organism in a certain way. But also this agent that I am is acting independent of the cells that are allowing me to move and to continue to think and to experience. And this is also very different from the purpose and the way in which the problems are solved by
the agent that is floating on top of the collective minds of man. And that man seems to be a unique machine in this scenario, but he's really only unique because of his fascination with himself and his awareness of himself. But again, I would like to bring all of this back to that reflection about these levels and about scaling, how it's not necessarily a prerequisite for that higher level, which I would consider to be an agent that is formed of different agents. It's emergent to a degree. But I suppose that we don't really have to label this as emergence, because we can think of agents at all different levels, but there is a way in which this does emerge, something more complicated, an agent that solves different problems at different scales can be considered an emergent phenomena, I suppose. It really doesn't matter necessarily, because we can think about all of these things at different levels. But all the same, I was just thinking about a podcast that I had done not too long ago about how the home is conceptual and also physical. And it would be kind of an interesting thing if we were to perceive the home as being an agent, which I think it is to a degree, and that we should approach the home as such, as we may approach a cell that is dynamic. But we can't approach it at the level that we would approach another human being, because the problems that the home solves is different. Our self-awareness, I think, makes us interesting agents in that regard, because we can modify our position relative to that agent or that agency. In a like manner, we can do so in terms of our city and our nation. And so why bother with any of this? What does this have to do with saying, I will do so to him as he has done to me? This has to do with the agent relationship within the arena, and that there is an important distinction that is, I think, being made or attempting to be made with the view of this agentic landscape in mind. That there is something negative at his level, but perhaps at other levels as well. That the behavior, such that an absolute reciprocation may be detrimental. And the question is, well, what is it detrimental to? Is it detrimental to the agent? Well, perhaps. If somebody is driving erratically and they cut me off in traffic, and I return the favor to them, which is not a favor, of course, it's a silly remark, but this can lead to further escalation. Now, is this necessarily the point? Perhaps this is something of a reason not to do it, because it can lead to a greater conflict. But I can also say that, well, what if somebody gave me a gift? Surely somebody has done this to me. They have, in the act of doing, they have given me a gift. Or perhaps they have done some kindness to me. And so, should I then not return kindness for kindness? And if this statement is to be literally true in all situations, then there's something that I'm missing, because certainly it would be a good thing to do to be kind to somebody. But I believe this verse is asking us to consider the cause, much like the last verse. Be not a witness against your neighbor without cause. Say not, I will do so to him as he has done to me, without cause. And I think that this is the distinction. Certainly I could be wrong about this, but this is seeming to satisfy some logical sequence. And that is to say that if we are to return some act of doing, and this is where the definition of doing, I think, is important. It means the performance of some action, to put, to place, to set, to cause, to make. From the discussion or the reflection of the agentic arena, and that agents are problem solvers at various levels, and that for an agent to exist, it almost must have some rootedness in this broader conception of the mindful landscape, perhaps, that it is plugged into the intelligible sphere. It receives its agency from without, that there is some aspect of creation that causes it to be the mover, the causer of causes. And perhaps it is the case that the performance of a particular action or the solving of a particular problem at a particular level of experience, and as we are considering here, this is the human experience. Perhaps what is happening, although it is certainly possible within man's will and his agentic capacity to do to others what they have done to him, certainly not impossible to do so. I could do it at any moment that I would like. But we are being asked not to do it for some reason. Now, it is possible that because of this larger arena, because of the place of man, now thinking relative to the place of a cell or relative to the agent that is the nation, we must consider the position of the agent within the broader map or network of agency. And I think every node in that network that may represent an organism or something, it could be an object, it has its place, partly because of relations, partly because of causes, and partly because of the way in which it is meant to articulate and solve different problems, as is in the case of life. And I think it is not for us to say that we are to abandon cause for some simple return, some simple exchange, one for one. For if something is done to us, it is not as though we immediately return it without reflection, or we ought not to return it without reflection. It's easy to imagine a bad scenario when reading this verse, but as I've mentioned, I think we can just as easily imagine a good scenario. So that obviously means that we cannot necessarily think of this in terms of good or bad. And that's not to say that thinking in terms of good or bad is wrong. I just think that it's not the approach that we should take. The approach that we should take is the examination of position and of authority. And that I think it is not within the authority of man to say, although he can do it, much like a cell can become cancerous, it is not their place to participate in the broader agent in that way, because it leads to the death of the agent. And I think that that which leads to absence is a negative thing and is a bad thing. But in a way, what we see here is a type of absence in which man is abandoning his cause, abandoning his purpose as a reasoning agent to return something almost like a repetition. It is a reflection that a man's response to this dilemma of something that is done to him is just to put up a mirror and say, well, thank you for your doing, thank you for your participation in the world, here's what it is. That doesn't make sense. It's more that his responsibility is somewhat, if not totally, at least somewhat, is within the capacity of making ethical decisions. And that it is within his authority to act according to the various elements in play. And it is not to throw up the mirror, to show a reflection, but it is actually to consider and to think independently and to come to a conclusion. Now, I don't necessarily think that this verse is prompting us to say that every action that is met by something, by some doing, especially if it is bad, is to just sort of sit down and let it pass. I think that's one potential option. But more so the point is to consider that we are the agents that are responsible for judiciously considering problems that confront us. This is our purpose, to solve these meaningful, purposeful, ethical dilemmas. And again, the mirror is not a solution. It is just a reflection. And so the follow-up is a way out of this mirror-like response, mirror-like existence, robotic existence perhaps. I will render to the man according to his work.
So today is a new day. Forgive me, it will take some time to get back up to speed, if the speed previous wasn't already slow enough. But the question is, in what way can we say that rendering to a man according to his work is different from doing to him as he has done to me? So we have the robotic aspect of this. We have the impersonal, it can be human, but it is lacking in terms of the responsibility of man. Now that's sort of an arbitrary distinction, I think, but there is something to it. Now, when I say arbitrary, maybe that's not the best word to use there, but there is something about the limited way in which one would respond if they were to respond in kind. Again, that robotic, completely equivalent reciprocation of a behavior or of an action. And as I had gone through before in that deliberation, the thing that is lacking seems to be reflection. It seems to be taking in different factors of the matter at hand, the contextual cues, and integrating everything into something that is more, we could say more reasonable, it's more intelligible, it is something that has an ethical substrate to it, that we are actually concerned about what the right course of action is,
that considers more than just ourselves, but the other individual and the broader map of things. It is, instead of this limited tit-for-tat call and response, it is more of a dynamic relationship. I could say it's reciprocal, even though I just used the word reciprocal in a negative manner. It's reciprocal in the sense that it's dynamic, a reciprocal dynamism to some response, either to some wrong or to some good that is done. Now, when we go into the field of I will render to the man according to his work, now we have an interesting behavior in the form of rendering, which I think I'll have to explore. And then the rendering based on the work of a person. The work seems to be something that is different than the doing of somebody. Perhaps there are some similarities there. I'm sure that there are equivalencies that we can draw. But the verse is not saying, I will render to the man according to what he does, or according to his doings. It is according to his works. And so I would like to explore that as well, even if it is the case that we ultimately come to some conclusion that there is not much difference between the workings of a man, or his work, and his doings. So let's begin with the word render. So from the Latin we have the prefix re, which means back. And we have the suffix dare, which is give. And so we have something that is effectively to give back. A Google definition, a contemporary definition, is provide or give a service, help, etc. Submit or present for inspection or consideration, to deliver in the sense of a verdict or judgment, hand over in the literary sense, cause to be or become, to make, to represent something or to depict it artistically. So from looking at this definition, I think another question that comes to mind is, well, how is it different using the word render, as I've just mentioned about the word work, relative to the word doing? Is it the case that at the end of the line, when we really think about what this word render is getting at, that actually what we are boiling it all down to is doing, then it would be the case that the verse would read, I will do to the man according to what he does. And I'm not too sure how different it is than the verse, I will do so to him as he has done to me. Perhaps we can say that there are slight differences, but I think that this verse is not, again, it's the words that are used that are in lockstep with the words do that are replaced by these words. They are meant to convey something broader, something larger, something more sophisticated. And so of the word render, how does it differ from the word do? So let's begin with the fundamentals. Let's begin with the root, to give back. Now certainly it can be the case that what we are giving back is the action that was done to us. But that calls into question, well, what is the nature of doing? Or rather, I should say, what is the nature of the word giving? It would seem that the word to give is an aspect of doing, but it's a particular type. It implies some sort of direction. And assuming that we are not to be passive-aggressive here, that there is something, there's a connotation that comes with give, and I may be wrong here. The more I think about it, I may change my mind, but to give somebody something almost implies a positive. Now, of course, we can give somebody a flu, for example, and that's definitely not positive.
And so the definition of the word give that I think makes most sense here is to cause or allow someone or something to have something. And so this is a bit independent of something that is good or something that is bad. We can give something to somebody that is equally good and equally bad. Depends on the situation. So from what I gather, I will render. So give back. Now it depends on what we're giving back, because we can be giving back something that is of his doing, that is of the man's doing, that perhaps it's easiest to imagine that it was a situation of some insult. But now what becomes fundamental in this part of the verse is the word work. And so what comes to mind when I think about this word is what he does, perhaps occupationally, or more importantly, what he spends his time doing, where his attention is, where most of his focus is. His works are sort of a conglomeration of his behaviors. It is not one particular doing, it is not one particular behavior, but it is it's an aggregate of differing aspects of the person. Of this aggregate, what I come to consider is actions and deeds. That is his behaviors. But again, it's behaviors that may not just be one situation. It's the behaviors throughout daily life that one exhibits. And so if we were to go off of this sort of thing, it requires contemplation, it requires observation, it requires time. I think of a moral and an ethical dimension, where in this situation a man's work is more of a symbol for the moral and ethical aspects of his behavior or of his actions. So while a man's doings or what he does, especially if we take a snapshot of one particular doing, we are all susceptible to various motivations and unfortunate motivations. Some, I think, are temporary, that flare the tempers and cause us to do things that we would regret later. But a man's doings, seems to me to be quite large, quite broad. And if we are to take just one of those, again the snapshot, and to judge a man based on that, I suppose we can come to some interesting conclusions depending on exactly what it is that he has done. But despite this, I think within a man's works, we're sort of going into the library, into the volume of his life, and we are asking him, what is it that you have paid attention to? Is there something that you have paid attention to that is more than what has been done here? Or perhaps, in the case of a good doing, in the previous half of the verse, this particular event, what you have done here, where does it fit in the broader theme, the broader motif of your life? Now, I think it's a harsh judgment, perhaps, to look at a man's life and say, I'm going to give to you as I've seen your proceedings in life. That seems to be a bit impractical and a bit harsh. And it's not as though judgments are meant not to be harsh. It is just I think we have to consider again our position and the types of judgments that we can make effectively and truthfully. So what do we have so far? Our main point of discussion here is returning or giving back this rendering. And the giving back would be, of course, some behavior in response to something that is received from the first half of the verse, whether that be good or bad. And we are not judging it. We're asked, I think, not to judge it based on the particular action, whether, again, it be good or bad. What we are being asked to consider is the motivation and the attention, the intention behind the doing. And so, whatever way I think that I choose to slice this, there is this unescapable dimension of the necessity of reflection and deliberation prior to returning something. Again, whether it be good or bad, it cannot be sort of a hairpin response. It cannot be a weak folding and then that propping up of the mirror to show the reflection. That is not, again, within that responsibility. The agent, the level that we participate in the world, we are much more than just that. And I'm not sure perhaps at what level that the first part of that verse would be appropriate, at what level of agency that would be appropriate. But for man, we have higher faculties, or at least we have faculties that would allow us to expand beyond one particular doing. And within a man's works, I think we have something that is more sophisticated, is broader. It considers the moral and ethical domain. It considers where his attention is. I think it, to a degree, considers his overall character, even though we may be limited, especially if we are going to be meeting this person for the first time and perhaps it's an insult that has occurred. And I think it is impractical to go through a person's entire history, but I don't think it's necessarily impractical to put forth the effort, perhaps to smooth over a situation and really determine what this person means by the action, the behavior that was put forth in their doings. And by going through this process, by unfolding this experience, we have more information. We have more information. I think we are better apt to make an appropriate judgment. Our judgment, especially our ethical judgments, our moral judgments, are more likely to be in line with the way that things ought to be, in the way of what most people would consider to be just. I'm not sure if diplomatic would be the right word, but there's a degree of diplomacy that I think is required in difficult situations. In any situation which requires one to render something to somebody else. I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. And lo, it was all grown over with thorns, and nettles had covered the face thereof, and a stone wall thereof was broken down. Then I saw, and considered it well. I looked upon it, and received instruction. So here we have 3 verses that are all related. I think perhaps, I get into this every time I mention this, but there's a thread of relatedness, I think, throughout the whole chapter. Some threads are more prominent and palpable than others. And as we continue, there are 2 remaining verses after these next 3 in this chapter. And I think even the remaining two might be related, but I'll save those for after the reflection on these three. But it is the case that these three verses have that palpable thread of relatedness. So let's start with the first, and this is verse 30. I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. Sort of an unfortunate sight to see, it would seem. Now, the slothful, I find a particularly painful word. And I think it's because that within myself I see a degree of the slothful. There are many times that I find myself engaging in unproductive behaviors, whether it be sleeping in too long, or more importantly, browsing random videos for who knows how long. Thankfully, I work enough and participate in this practice so it puts off some of the negative effects of it, but it is still too much. But within the word slothful, I think there's something there that all of us can understand, that many of us wish to avoid. This sense of idleness, laziness, this indolence, inactiveness. Now, perhaps there's not much reason needed to describe or to say why this is bad. In my situation, or in my case, I have plenty of understanding why it's bad. And I've paid much attention to mitigating the negative effects of it, although I'm not perfect. For it is this behavior, the slothful behavior, that gets the mind into trouble. It moves the mind away from productive things towards meaningful things, purposeful things, towards that which is basic, dull, inert. It has really no productive capacity to it. These behaviors, I think, are well afforded in the modern day by our technological sophistication. I have to wonder, of course this is an age-old thing, that must be if I'm reading it in the Bible, even in the situation of societies that have not been as well off, slothfulness has occurred. Now, in the case of addiction, there's a degree of slothfulness there, or certain situations of homelessness in which people really do not wish to participate in some broader collective. And I think it's within the mind of these people that perhaps they're not necessarily deserving of a scorn, for we should not be scorners. We are prompted against this type of behavior, but rather it is a battle, even if it appears to our eyes that their situation is tame, in the sense that their behavior and their acceptance of their way of life may be somewhat certain. But within every person there is this capacity for transformation and salvation. And so although the war may be on pause, there may be a truce, a ceasefire, the war rages nonetheless for the slothful person. And it is something that I think ought to be seen as unfortunate. And those of us who are outside of it, or at least enough away from it, that we can appreciate how much of the productive life brings fulfillment, despite the hardships that it may induce. Now, today is a new day. It is Wednesday, right in the middle of the week, or perhaps we're over the middle of the week now. Wednesday is over. It is in the evening. Work is over. A long day.
And I'd like to begin this segment with a thought of a general feeling that I get from time to time, or perhaps disposition. There are different types of experiences that I go through in life, and there are consistent patterns, and there are ups and there are downs. There are periods of distrust. I wanted to say faithlessness, but maybe not necessarily faithlessness, but there is a sense in which I feel shaken, like I don't stand on firm ground. And sometimes I'm not sure where exactly the feeling comes from. Sometimes it's worse than others. Other times, if it's relatively benign, it serves as something that is interesting to reflect on. I'm still an agent that has some standing in the faithful domain, even when I undergo some of these unfortunate situations. But the point here is that I'm able to look down on it and reflect and think about it, almost as if I'm thinking about the behavior of a child and considering how to correct the path, rather than necessarily feeling myself like a child and lacking in self-awareness. Those types of those days of faithlessness really don't come back to haunt me, but I do remember them. Now, I say all of this because there was a few things that came up today. One, a particular experience, in which I was speaking with somebody that I was required to speak to, and it was evident that the conversation just did not begin well. Now, the particulars don't really matter here, and I will say that I promise that this is going to return back to the verse in some way. But the particulars don't matter. It was more of my response to it, or perhaps my feeling. The feeling is something that I caught early, but I found it interesting. Looking back on it now, I wish I had done more to reflect on it and to chip away at it so it didn't really stay with me. Of course, nothing bad came about. The situation was handled as it ought to have been handled. But nonetheless, there was this feeling, almost like in the last verse, say not, I will do so to him as he has done to me. I felt myself in an instant, my emotions almost betrayed me. They set up a mirror. I wanted to reflect what was being given to me, and that the information just wasn't really entering into me, that I wasn't able to decode and to interpret and to move towards that truthful plane as effectively as I would have liked to, because the emotions and perhaps a little bit of anger had got in the way, unfortunately. But again, the situation was okay. It was handled, again, as it ought to have been handled. But nonetheless, there have been other situations in which I have found myself comforting my heart better than I had done in that situation. And in the situations where the heart wishes to throw up the mirror and reflect what is being done in an effort to show the other person what it looks like so that they can feel the same, the goal is to take them on the path that I am walking, towards that path of goodness. And sometimes it can be a difficult invitation, because it depends on where they are starting whether or not they will accept the invitation. Now, the invitation is reciprocal, because if somebody chooses and decides to go on that journey, on that path, then both parties will undeniably benefit. Both parties are on the journey towards that goodness, towards that righteousness. In any case, this is number one. Number two occurred after work. Now, the second situation was after I had finished work and I had eaten my dinner. I was watching or listening to something, as I usually do when I eat. And it was a prominent figure in the American cultural landscape that was speaking about a principle that was beyond the generally accepted sphere of understanding. And to many, and probably to all, what was being described could not be considered to be true. And yet they were going about their opinion and their belief as though it was true. They had such a firm conviction that it was true. And the arguments that they had put forth were, in essence, sophists' arguments. They didn't hold much weight. And I think that this situation directly related to the situation that I had earlier today. And it also directly relates to this verse. There's an element of sincerity, the spirit of the genuine, and the domain of the good, of whom they are considered chiefly of what is true and of what is right, and what is true is often difficult in the human context. And I think there's a degree of diplomacy that is required there. In both situations, it's a matter of what path to take, of what road to walk. Now, in this manner, I mean partly it is, I think there are two things here. One can be confident about the path that they walk, because the path that they walk is all that they know. And when they started walking, perhaps they had one thing in mind, and when they had discovered more, maybe they were tempted, the path became perverse. It was something from the original purpose altered, that the foundations were no longer the same. And if one is to embark on a particular journey with goodness in mind, it is quite difficult, I think, to maintain any sort of rigid conviction without accepting the possibility of being incorrect. Now, I think that there are irreconcilable differences between minds. There are some things that it's just too difficult to determine that which is true. That's not to say that it's impossible to determine that which is true. But here I would like to point out that in the situations of hardship, or in the situations in which we desire to know something or to hold on to something that we think we know, it is a principle, I think, of the heart of man and the mind of man to be willing to weather the storm in a particular situation in which we feel as though we are unsteady or uncertain, that our mind feels abandoned and alone. I think it is up to us to weather that storm and to accept it and to learn from what it has to show us, for our resilience in the face of that stress and our failures in the face of that confrontation will teach us about the path itself. And to deny our failures and to say that we failed because there was something wrong with the way in which the world had presented something to us is selfish. There's an immorality to it. And both in the situation that I was listening to when I was eating my dinner, of the person that was overly confident in something that most people almost intuitively understand is incorrect, and my situation earlier with the discussion that I had with a person that was in negative spirits, it is the manner in which we preserve our character under the constantly changing and chaotic conditions of life that we learn the most from. And I think that preservation of character is an interesting question. Now, it permeates the slothful person, as I've mentioned in the closing to that last segment of audio. There's an unfortunate reality that permeates the mind of the slothful, that there is a decision that was made, that who knows where the path began. Perhaps there are many paths in life. It's hard to say exactly. It's hard to analyze a human being at that level. It's easier when it's one's own personal experience. But the slothfulness is a type of buckling of character under the superficial desires of the heart. By the vineyard of the man void of understanding, I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. The second part of the verse, I think, is certainly related to that first, but the second part is almost in lockstep with what I experienced today. What does it mean to pass by this field of a man that is void of understanding? And perhaps there's a certain part of myself that passed by the field in which I saw a reflection of myself that was void of understanding. I suppose that must have been it, for I didn't understand the feeling that I was feeling, and so I wanted to raise up the wall and to push back that feeling out into the world, and to return like for like. Instead of to analyze it and say, look above it and look down on it and say, okay, I can see this for what it is. But I can see this for what it is because I can see outside of it that I am not confined by this anger. I'm not confined by the state of mind that is difficult to describe, perhaps, the state of mind that feels injured, that feels insulted or taken from. That although these feelings may permeate me within the storm, it is something that I try my best to prevent it from permeating my constitution. And there's something there, I think, within one's constitution that directly relates to this understanding. And a man that is void of understanding struggles with that constitutional element. And I can speak, again, from my own experience today, that I think that when I went through this experience, I was able to hold on enough, and I didn't reflect what I wanted to reflect. But what I was disappointed at was that I wasn't able to completely turn that experience towards that which was right. And I think that, almost in a paradoxical sense, as much as the heart can feel insecure about its constitution, it can feel secure about constitutional elements. And so it's almost like finding a key that fits into a lock, that we know that it is successful when it unlocks the lock, and we can open the door. Except in this situation, this experiential situation, instead of a key in a physical apparatus, a lock, it is a feeling that solves the problem. It is a melody, perhaps. Now, I suppose I should say that I don't necessarily think that it's restricted to a feeling. It certainly can be a reason. There are plenty of reasonable things that unlock or that solve problems, solve puzzles. I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of a man void of understanding. Now I wonder at the significance, before I move on to verse 31. We have a repeating pattern, but much like in the last verse, there's a differing word. Instead of field, we have vineyard. And the question in my mind, is there any significance to this vineyard and its association with the man of understanding, or man void of understanding? Perhaps there's an allusion to alcohol consumption, that the person that occupies the vineyard is using it for purposes that would reduce his productive capacity rather than to advance it. Perhaps there's something in that. It's hard for me to say, really. I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of a man void of understanding. And lo, it was all grown over with thorns, and nettles had covered the face thereof, and a stone wall thereof was broken down. So here we have an image of something that was perhaps once beautiful, now grown over, decayed. The attention that was once required to keep it pristine and to keep it beautiful had long ago faded. And although the man is still there, the environment has suffered because of his inaction, his lack of attention, his misunderstanding, his slothful behavior. Now, this is what I truly enjoy about the Proverbs, about the image that is presented, about what is laid before me. The image for which many different reflections can satisfy, that parallel, that conduit. And it is through the filtering of, whether it be of my own personal experiences or observations about the experience of others, or broader, larger scale experiences, whether it be nationally or culturally. I think it would be hard to say that there would be anyone that has not understood, at least to a degree, of what this means, of passing by the slothful person, no matter how large or small one's behavior. Passing by the man that is void of understanding. We all make mistakes. There's no way to completely pave out the path in front of us in a way that would be 100% beneficial and productive. For who knows what that really means. It comes to us in small pieces, and we digest it as it comes. We learn from it as it comes. But just considering this landscape, I think it becomes easier to see when it happens to us, once we are aware of it,
And when we make a mistake, or when we pass by an image that seems to us unsavory, we know this to be so because we have been there before. I think more importantly, when we have been there before in a particular experience, we've reflected on it. And we've been able to grow from the experience. Then I saw and considered it well. I looked upon it and received instruction. It's fascinating. It provokes a certain feeling in me. A feeling that is sort of longing for this experience. To pass by the slothful and man that is void of understanding, and to see the waste that they have left behind, or that the unfortunate encampment that they now occupy, in whatever facet and whatever domain of my life that it happens to be in. I search to find it. I search to find it out of pity. I search to find it out of excitement. I search to find it with the hope that this situation is well within my control to rectify, to change, to rebuild that stone wall, and to cut the thorns from the vines. You know, I often long for something that is foundational. I think we all do. And I always come back to the image of the house and the symbol that it represents. And not necessarily the discussion between the house and the home, which I've gone through often, but more so in terms of the physical structure. And even more so, I think of a house that I've been in often. And in the crawl space, one is afforded an interesting view of the end product, of the material that holds up this large house, of the metal I-beams that run along its length, and of the wood panels that are stationed above it, of all the various pipes and tubes through which wires run and different appliances operate. I often wonder and I often think about my own mind in this way, almost like a house. Within it, behind its walls, behind that thing that I present not only to myself but also to the world as a finished product. Something of drywall that is smoothed over, that is painted, it is furnished. But of course behind it is the structural elements. Not that the furnishings are unimportant, but without firm foundations, the furnishings mean very little. If a roof cannot keep out the elements, or if the floorboards cannot hold my weight, then what is the benefit of having these superficial distinctions, the superficial furnishings? One is only afforded the home environment when the structure of the house stands firm. And in my mind, I've been thinking about this all of my life, some days more than others. And on days when I am least attentive, or I'm trying to run away from it perhaps, run away from the slothful man, or running away from the man that is void of understanding, what inevitably happens is that I find myself in a little nook somewhere that seems to me to be fresh pastures,
And yet what I find is, in time, that pasture grows, and that which I had built for myself there begins to decay. And it comes to be the situation and the case that I have to reorganize, to reconstitute. And that although I have experienced many times in life, many periods in which I have been strong and have readily replaced and kept firm these constitutional elements, there have undoubtedly been times where, as I've said, I've ran away to places that I think are firm, that will support me, but it is just furnishings. It is something that ought to come after the strong foundation, the constitutional elements. A sort of putting the cart before the horse situation. The horse will not pull the carriage or the cart if it's behind it. It must be in front of it. Now, be all of that as it may, and as interesting as that reflection is, I think there's another layer still yet to go. The reflection on what it means to undergo that experience of reconstitution. Reconstitutionalization, perhaps. And in my experience, what I've discovered is that this process is painful. It can be painful. But the only real reason that it is painful in the first place is because it was abandoned at some point later, that I had taken for granted what I had built, and I tried to live rent-free. And what I mean by that is that since I had put in the effort up front, I try to convince myself that no, that effort is sufficient. You have produced something that is strong, and now it will exist perpetually throughout time. And that, unfortunately, for our state in life, is not the case. It requires continual modification, regrowth, repair, renewal, rebirth, reorganization. And it seems as though these principles of rebirth, reorganization, reconstitution would happen regardless of if we had found ourselves in the situation of the slothful or the man void of understanding. Except in the case of the diligent person, the diligent man, when he comes to the point of reconstitution, he will understand what he needs to do. The sacrifice will not necessarily be painful, but rather some exciting journey to be undertaken, not a burden that should be placed on his shoulders. And I don't necessarily say this to say that there will be no burdens, or that there will be no pain. I think necessarily there must be some pain. But again, what I seek to avoid is that mind of the addict that runs so far down into the darkness in an attempt to escape from something. That feeling that haunts him. That before he knows it, he can't see anything. That the brush has overgrown so much, and the foundational principles of his inner constitution, of his self, are so poorly degraded like the stone wall, that reconstitution to him seems impossible, or a task that is too insurmountable. And of course, life in this state of mind becomes dismal and desolate. He would prefer some despot to make decisions for him rather than to reconstitute himself. And now I've mentioned that as I read that verse, I was thinking not only of myself and of the various situations in my life that I've seen these images, but also in terms of the current cultural and political landscape. That it is something that appears to me that is unfolding slowly, but unfolding quickly relative to the days past, given our current technological situation. And I have to wonder, certainly, of the agent that exists on the top of the collective mind, that the change that may occur within the soul of man at the individual level will impact the sway and the outlook of the agent that exists on top of him. Now, this change can be in any number of ways. It can be towards this state of degradation. It could be of an experience of life that is lived under the unfortunate cycle of gain and loss, of the cycle of the addict that functions only so much as he needs to in society, that he lets his foundations decay up until the point of it being almost at the threat of his life that he must return to it and reestablish some basic foundation such that he will not fall and perish beneath it. And in such a situation, such a weakened mind, those who have more of a wicked disposition will come and sweep in to capitalize, or to, maybe capitalize is not the right word, but inhabit or parasitize that mind, to use it, to control it. Now, there are other situations in which, as I've mentioned, this vineyard, the man that is void of understanding, may be propositioned. He may be called. He may be woken from his slumber. His attention may be activated. He may see the light. He may find some inner hope, some inner peace, some inner drive and motivation, by which he understands that his state in life could be more if he put forth a better effort. And this better effort is a consequence of his attention, of where it is placed. And of the landscape of where it is placed, we think about the landscape of mind. We think about the landscape of motivations. Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so shall your poverty come as one that travels, and your want as an armed man. I should say that today is a new day. It's a good day because it's Friday. It's after work. It's in the evening. It's about 7 p.m., 6:58 to be exact. And I'm feeling a particular way. Feeling thankful that the week is over, but also eager to do something productive as I enter into a few days that I have time to do productive things outside of work. And so I would like to try and make this session as best I can. Now, I try to do that always, but right now I have a particular spirit that seems to be inhabiting me, so I will run with it. So where we stand right now, we are at the end of chapter 24, and these last series of verses here, pretty much from 30 to 34, are all connected. And
these last remaining verses that I've read are probably going to conclude this episode, however long they will take. And so I see before me many paths that I can take. I'm considering thinking about what it means to consider. I'm thinking about the aspects of the traveler, of the good and of the bad, and how we ought to approach something. And that is to say that of a particular person, of an object. I was thinking about this earlier today, that there seems to be different ways in which one can see something, and depending on the way in which they see it, it can be spun as a positive or spun as a negative. That statement seems fairly obvious now that I hear myself say it, but I see it culturally. I see it in the way that we present ourselves information. It's easy to see in the political domain, especially in the United States. It happens to be 2024, on the eve of a contentious election for which many have placed high hopes, but many of us also feel that it doesn't really matter what happens. We are part of this broader river that has taken us far from our home. That we have fallen into this river, I should say, and it has taken us far downstream, downriver. And it is within these aspects that we choose to accept certain things and deny others. That even in the face of some adversary, we are willing to accept some quite lofty sins, just so that our adversary may not be given an advantage. So perhaps I'll come to all of these points. There are more that are on my mind, but I don't want to waste time in the fragmentary. And so when I was going about my day today, I had the feeling, strange way that I experience the world, I had a feeling, a memory that was the feeling of yesterday, my yesterday's recording, and about what I wanted to necessarily go into for today. And I thought that I had not looked at verse 32 in sufficient detail. And that is, then I saw and considered it well. I looked upon it and received instruction. And so I want to begin with breaking down this word consideration. And that means, of course, like usual, we're going to go through the etymological chain. It's going to be a drudge-filled business. Then when I find that we have got to some definition of the word consideration, then we will refer back to the verse and open it up again and see what we can play with, see what we can do and integrate into our scaffolding, the scaffolding of the self. So to begin, let's go to Latin. We're thinking about the term consideration, or to consider. So we have the word considerare, meaning to look closely at, to observe, to examine, to think about. We have the prefix con, which is with or together. And then we have sidus, the root, which means star or constellation. And so from the Latin we have the observation of the stars.
In this situation, when we are observing the stars, we are looking at patterns. We are identifying qualities. Of a constellation, I think of images that we find and that we see. It's pattern recognition. At its base level, I think we do this pretty much for everything, not just the stars that form constellations. And so we will hold this in our hands as we go through this, that this is something, to consider something is to recognize, to identify, to observe patterns. And what I mean by patterns is something that is, perhaps it could be regular, it could be something that is identified, independent of something else because of the way that the elements are organized. It is something that generally can be identified based on various qualities. I mentioned qualities earlier in the process of consideration. That it involves that process of identifying qualities, the qualities that make up some pattern of identity. From the Old French, we have considerer, meaning to reflect upon, to observe, or to examine. This word was then adopted into Middle English as considerin. In Middle English, the meaning stayed largely the same, to think about, to reflect upon, or to examine. And so we have the word con, which is with or together. Now in the modern usage, we have the meanings of the following: to think about carefully, to ponder or to reflect on something with attention and thought. We have the aspect of regarding or deeming, to view or judge in a certain way, to take something into account, to factor in or think about something as part of a decision process. And so, when I think about this word consider and everything that I've just mentioned here, we have attention, we have the deliberate modification or direction of attention towards something, the recognition of some pattern, the identification of qualities within the environment or wherever we choose to see, and then the integration into some identity. There are many ways in which qualities can be identified. That is, to establish or to indicate who or what something is. It is a fundamental observation and formation of a memory. Then I saw and considered it well. And what we must remember is that we are considering the overgrown thorns and nettles, the stone wall that was broken down, and all of this in the presence of the slothful and the man that is void of understanding. So when we think about this environment, this milieu, what we are seeing is a pattern, much like we look up into the sky at night and we see the stars and we see certain things, certain patterns. Now, of course, the obvious pattern to see here is that the slothful and the man of understanding was responsible for the overgrowth and for the general unkemptness of the environment. That there's something about the qualities of these people, not the inherent value of the person, but there's something about the quality, the cultural characteristic of the person and the identity that is formed out of them that cause this type of failure of being, this failure of identity. And the manifestation of the types of qualities and identities that we we find displeasing. Again, the fractured wall, the overgrown thorns and nettles. Now, there are many situations, there are many instances in which I have driven past a town, or I've driven across a road that is poorly kept, and my mind doesn't necessarily consider it. Perhaps it does to a degree, that I wouldn't like to live there, and that's a type of consideration. But it's not considering it well. I haven't thought about what it necessarily means for a road to become void of the reproductive element, that there is no care that is being directed into the upkeep of the infrastructure, or of the depressed nature of a small town or of a large city. I think of St. Louis. Going through that city, the infrastructure is terrible. There are certain parts of that city, and every city for that matter, that are just squalor. It is difficult to imagine that individuals with particular qualities, communities with particular qualities, despite relatively poor means, would still allow their surrounding to become so hostile to the state of beauty. I looked upon it and received instruction. Now, I think there's a certain irony in this, and that the teacher of what one ought to do came from a place that is so undesirable, that is, again, void of beauty. And it is because of this situation and this circumstance that may prompt us to consider that a change may be necessary. Now, I've had a flash of something, a thought, an opinion, of my reflections on these Proverbs, and at times I go through these waves of thinking, these waves and ways of thinking that perhaps are external, more observational about the way things are, independent of my own self-participation. And then there are other times that I really wish to dive into myself and to critique it and to change those internal elements so that I do not run into bad situations, that I do not find myself possessed by the qualities of the slothful or of the man that is void of understanding. And if I go long enough thinking about things that are outside of myself, or at least independent of myself, things start to become stale, because I know that I am not actually tinkering with the mechanism, the gears that are within my own self-identity. And since I'm not doing that tinkering, I'm not doing the work to be better, to do more. And so for a moment, I would like to dive into my mind and to do some house cleaning. Then I saw and considered it well. I looked upon it and received instruction. So the question is, what do you see when you look back there in the mind? In that landscape that at once seems to be so plain, perhaps not in terms of intelligence, but in terms of the day-to-day, that the mind so often wishes to be operated on a state of inconsideration, that it wishes to operate on flow, to operate on on programming that it is quite difficult to run the operating system and continually put out new code, novel situations, continual consideration and self-reflection. Much of my working hours are an attempt, I think, to get into the flow, and I don't think that the flow is a bad thing. But the flow can be restrictive in the sense that if we are not constantly moving ourselves above the clouds, so to speak, up to the next level, the level for which within the flow state we may be relatively comfortable, even if it's quite intense. That revving of the engine to dip above the clouds to the next plane is always something that I think we should hunger for. It's something that I think I should hunger for. And I've noticed that at times I find my foot getting a bit anxious, that it is pounding on the floor, sort of restless leg syndrome. Now I mean this in some sense physically, because I do this often, but as my mind has considered it, that's not necessarily where the memory has come from, but perhaps they are related. That there is this anxiety about staying below the clouds and understanding that I am at the verge of breaking through the cloud, otherwise I wouldn't be so anxious. My mind is ready to step on the gas, to spring up to the next level. And once I spring up to that next level, the exertion that I had spent will cause me to require to readjust or to acclimate to that new level, and then to do it again. The question becomes, well, how often, how frequent am I able to do this? And perhaps the answer should be as often as we can, so as far as the mind doesn't blow a fuse and fall down a bunch of levels like an addict. This is not a good thing. But certainly I must get more specific about what this means. As far as my experiences in life go, if I find myself on a plane for which I am spending too long, my interactions become stagnant. There's a certain beauty, I think, within human communication that allows us to reciprocally grow and to ascend these levels together. Especially in the situation of teaching and of learning, this can often be a reciprocal process. I think it should be directed by one that is guiding the path, but nonetheless, the path is walked by more than one individual. Now, the processes by which my mind comes to this layer or level of stagnation involves my unwillingness to pay attention adamantly, to consider consistently, because I think that there is a quality of the slothful that is there. The slothful that says, let your mind take a break. It's okay. Let it stop and do nothing. And I think that there's a difference here between this nothingness and the mind that truly relaxes into productive grace. That is, there is this period of breathing out after an intense effort, whether it be physical or psychological. My interactions have been, as of late, this past week, I've noticed it, lacking in a particular type of attention that I know I ought to be putting forth, but I would rather be within my own comfort and to fall back on a previous layer for which I know the engine can comfortably run. That there's not too much difficulty in first gear, so I'll just sort of coast. Doesn't matter how long it takes me to get to where I need to go, because I'm going there. But it's really not a matter of the beginning and the ending. It's not point A to point B along the horizontal. I know that I will get there. It's the vertical in addition to the horizontal. It is how many levels or how many layers of mind, how many layers of attention, what type of experience can I have that will change my perspective or give me a greater perspective, that will teach me more about my discipline that I can grow from and that I can give to another person. How is it that I could surrender the aspects of myself that serve to be a boundary for my own growth? That there is information that comes from other individuals for which I may reject because of my own selfishness. And that it seems to me to be a matter of my own willingness and desire to attend and to sacrifice and to commit to what I know to be a painful journey and yet a rewarding journey. And so as I sit here, I think about goals that I might want to set for the upcoming work week, and of the interactions with the people that I work with, but also interact with on the market front, that is the service that I provide. And if I were to make a goal, I think the goal is going to be to improve my attention towards that service that I'm offering, the presence that I give off, the drive and the focus that is there, and the sort of the mutual, that reciprocal journey, the invitation to that reciprocal journey. Even though I think for many, and even myself at times, the journey through the woods is difficult. The weather is too hot, the mosquitoes are too intense. But the experience needs to be had nonetheless. And that it is not an excuse that nature has provided us with a difficult hand for our sensory apparatus to process. It should be at this level of mind and of culture that we achieved, that we can progress beyond this, and to truly be good, to be good people, to be faithful, to be committed, to be disciplined, to be integrative, to be proportioned, all of this sort of thing. But we nonetheless remain human beings, implying that we exist at a certain level, at a certain plane of experience and of mind. Yet a little sleep and a little slumber and a little folding of the hands to sleep. So what I'm getting from this immediately is a type of temptation. Now I have a poem that is very early on in my YouTube channel that goes over temptation. That I had went to the store and I bought a bunch of cupcakes one day, and I devoured the box of cupcakes. Now this situation was much more than just a box of cupcakes, obviously, but it was a culmination of a bunch of things and a bunch of failures that really put me in a bad way. And that poem was sort of the result of that. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little foldings of the hand hands to sleep. Now, I physically had this experience on Thursday, which had been yesterday, and my plan was to work out after work. And I had made an excuse to myself that now I'll push it off till tomorrow morning before work, which didn't happen, and for which I was paying the price for later, consciously. Mentally, I didn't feel as sharp. I felt that I had betrayed myself and my duties, that I had failed to go on the journey that I needed to go on to improve myself and to be a better person, to actually work out, in the sense that I am working out weakness, working out inhibitions, working out the aspects of myself that keep me from being better. And I literally said, okay, you're going to do it in the morning, that's fine. And I lay down in my bed and I fell asleep. Because my mind was fatigued from the day. And as soon as my head hit the pillow, essentially, I was out. And that was a terrible thing to wake up from, even though the nap was really only an hour. I knew that I had failed in that moment. But what is it exactly? Because it doesn't have to literally be sleep. It could be anything that causes our attention to be less than, or to be distracted by something. Is it within the excuse? Is it within the desire of having some type of experience that moves the mind towards nothingness? I think it is both. The excuse is pushing something away, such that we don't have to do that thing that we are responsible for. And so instead of doing something, we are wishing to do nothing, or to do something else, which, by extension, is not doing the thing that we are responsible for, which is a form of doing nothing. And so I'm always eager, in a sense, to find those things that lead one to nothingness. Because throughout the Proverbs, over and over again, we are instructed in this possibility, potential towards wickedness and towards evil, towards foolishness, all of which really have this ingrained path towards nothingness. Now, in certain situations, in some of these distinctions, the path towards nothingness may not be explicit. It may not necessarily be direct. It may be a path that somebody walks but really doesn't understand the consequences. Or it could be explicit. It could be someone that wishes for existence to come to an end, for nothing to be. So shall your poverty come to one that travels, and your want as an armed man. Now this is the last verse in chapter 24, ending with an interesting one. So shall poverty come as one that travels. So what is this identity of the one that travels? How is it related to this poverty? The traveler may or may not be without a home, but is likely without a home. He is constantly looking for a place to stay. I think of the axis here, the axis around which he rotates. I think of the hearth. In absence of the physical location for which he spends his meaningful time, he must find some other dimension. He must find a place within his mind or a place within a community of travelers, perhaps, may be more difficult to find. But nonetheless, I think he is limited by his constant motion. And it's not perhaps motion full stop, it is the type of motion. It is the motion that is not revolutionary, it is not axial in nature. So shall your poverty come as one that travels. Now this is also obviously implying that the traveler cannot be a rich person. I suppose it could be the situation that a rich person can become a traveler. And in that sense, you would have a rich traveler. But if a traveler is somebody of modest means that begins traveling, very soon they would find themselves in a steady state of being without. At the very least, especially in the ancient world, it's different these days, I suppose. A traveler would not have access to a large amount of resources if they were moving far away from those resources. And of course, these days we have digitization, which allows us to be in contact with our monies. But a traveler in the old days would only have so much room for that type of thing. And as a consequence, he would be required to serve others as he needed. He would stop by temporarily, perhaps to tend a field or to assist in building something, such that he would be able to receive payment and then food for the time being. But the traveler is a drifter of sorts. Again, that hearth and that steadiness and dependability of work is just not there. And I think that there are good things and bad things about the traveler. One of the things that I had mentioned about the outset for this day was the reflection on the aspects of an identity, and how, based on perspective, there can be aspects of an identity that are good and aspects of an identity that are bad. And of the traveler, I think I see both. That there is this independence that is liberating from certain things, but also within his independence is a type of crushing imprisonment, that he is not bound to anything that is solid and foundational, that he is always left to be adrift in a sea of insecurity and of perpetual want. And your want is an armed man. Now, what could this possibly mean? Here again, I would refer to identity, because we are saying that this man is an armed man. This is his identification, that of where his attention is towards the arms. It is towards the weapon, the sword, or the gun, whatever the situation is. As the attention is brought to the weapon, I think necessarily our focus is then on the possibilities that can be afforded one with a weapon, especially one that has a weapon and is in want. I think the likelihood of a person to use such a thing in order to get what they want increases. Doesn't necessarily mean that they will, but there is this implication there that they will use it to get what they want, especially if they are facing destitution and that they are hungry. And so I think these two verses, it can apply as much to the destitute situation as it can to the landscape of mind within a society that has an abundance of material goods as we do. And that an armed man in this situation can be somebody with influence, with social media following, whatever it might be. And in absence of that spiritual capital, the hunger for which must be intense. And I think the solution for many is to use anything in their means to gain that type of comfort. And as we understand about man's actions and behaviors in the presence of extreme longing, I think he could find all sorts of things to fill that void, many of which are not good. And so this sleep and lack of attentiveness towards that mental, psychological, or spiritual domain, I think can cause one to come to a type of poverty that is akin again to this traveler, that lacks that steady axis of rotation for which he is always bound. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I will continue next time with chapter 25.